Welcome to the Building in Decentraland video series. These videos are recordings of the live sessions of the inaugural class offered by the VR Academy, which is a school within Decentraland University. My name is Carl Fravel, and I'm the instructor of this course. These videos are largely unedited recordings of the live class sessions. The descriptive text provided below this video includes information about Decentraland, a virtual reality on the blockchain, the Decentraland University and its schools, including the VR Academy, and the course materials for this course, including the lessons and assignments. I hope that you enjoy studying these materials and that they help you to become a very capable builder in Decentraland. Greetings. Can you hear me? I see that there are 8 people on the line.
Yeah, I can hear you, Carl.
Very good, thank you. I was trying to get some special stuff ready for the class and was having some difficulties, so I'm running just a little bit late, and I apologize for that. I chose to switch the order of the 6th and 7th lessons because I want to make sure that we had the land loan from Decentraland worked out before we did lesson about deploying land. It looks to me like I'm going to have that land available to loan to students within the next day or two, maybe even this weekend, but certainly by next week sometime. So we'll do that lesson, obtaining land and deploying scenes to it. We'll do that next week. This week we're going to do an exploration of Git repositories and how to host your scenes privately in the cloud without putting them on land. But before we do, does anybody have any questions or any review questions about the Builder HUD or the use of the spawner functions module?
I actually did have one question. With the little red icon that was supposed to be over the specific entity that you were trying to move around, I was having a problem. It wasn't showing. It wasn't showing up in my scene when I attached that entity to it.
Yes, there's a known problem that I don't know how high to put the red thing because there's no way in a script that I can determine how tall something is. And I'm guessing that the object was either rather tall vertically, and so the red object was inside it, or you had it up in the air a ways already and you couldn't see that it was up above it. The view of it was blocked. In either of those cases, you won't be able to see it. You can always just try, clicking on position by a meter and see if it jumps over. You can jump it right back a meter to see which object it is if you can't find the red thing. But it's a known problem. Eventually, I'm hoping there's a way that Decentraland allows us in a script to get the kind of the bounding box of an object so I can put it above that. But that's a known problem. Were you able to get past that and move things around anyway?
Yeah, I was able to. It was just, I attached it to one entity and then just moved that. So.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. Yep,
you're welcome. I'm thinking I might want to move, add one more level of granularity to the 4 settings of how much movement or rotation to do, especially I think in the rotation. I need it there. 1 degree of rotation can still be kind of big. So that's another thing I'm thinking of doing. And there's another known problem in that when you use the star button to create a new entity where it drops a widget on the ground where you're standing, the very first time you click it, it drops a widget at 0, 0, 0. And that's because there's a bug in the SDK. I would call it a bug, that at least at the very beginning of a scene, until something happens, and I haven't figured out what that is, your camera position of your avatar is at that location, 0, 0. By the time you click a second time, it's fixed itself and it puts it where your feet are. So I have reported that bug a while back. It's not a big hindrance to use of the thing, because if you want to put something where your feet are, where you're standing, just click it once to drop something at 0, 0, and then one more time to put it where your feet are. So that's another known problem with it. So there's a few more things I want to do to improve it. And if anybody has any other suggestions or issues with it. Did anybody find that it sort of worked, but you didn't see, you saw the builder HUD, but it was blank? And didn't know how to resolve that? If you see that, and it seems like maybe everybody figured that out, but when you get the code from the Builder HUD project in GitLab, you also need to get the materials directory and a couple of subdirectories from the models directory in that project and put them all in your project, as well as the Builder HUD.ts code module, because it needs all that stuff to show up right. Did anybody have any questions about the spawner functions module and what it's for, how to use it? Seems like many people have figured out how to incorporate these modules made by somebody else into their code, and that's a good thing. Decentraland has just released a set of utilities, a module, I don't remember the name of it, it's called something like DCL utilities or something like that. I haven't studied it yet, but it has a bunch of useful stuff in it. And you can find out about it in their blog. I think they also mentioned it in their announcements of the SDK hack, the game jam, excuse me. So I'll try to take a look at it sometime in the next week or two and provide some commentary here on it. Any other review questions before we move on? I want to thank people for sending me contact information, names, email addresses, and Ethereum addresses. We will need those Ethereum addresses in order to allocate you some land to use. I don't presume that land will be yours permanently. In fact, it won't be in your wallet, so to speak, but your wallet will be assigned the role, at least temporarily. I have an agreement with Decentraland at least through March of next year to allow that land to be loaned to you. And that works by a piece of land can have, in addition to an owner, it can have other roles for updating. And you'd have a role to use that wallet address to do a deployment to that land. So I'm hoping that comes in the next few days and I can start allocating those. I'm going to provide it to people who, number one, have finished assignment 4, and number 2, have provided me your Ethereum address for the MetaMask wallet account that you want to use for that. All right, so let's go on with the new material. So let's talk a little bit about why one would want to use Git. Git is it's a version control system. It's one way of describing it. So here's a typical problem. You're going merrily along working on your project, and you've introduced something that just is really wrong, just not working the way you want, and you want to go back to an earlier version. But if you haven't been keeping snapshots of every version that was working along the way, you can't really go back. You just kind of have to try to undo things to try to fix them. So one of the nice things about a version control system is that every time your code, your scene is stable, it's like it's at a good milestone, you're okay with it. You can check it into your version control system. And then you go on working. And if you really don't like what's happened, you can back it out just by going back to a previous version. You can also make a branch in your versioning tree. If you want to try something and maybe it'll work and you'll bring it in onto your main code base, or maybe you'll abandon it because it was an experiment that didn't work. So the version control isn't just a series of steps, but it's a tree with branches. Second reason why you want to use a Git repository is if you have more than one person working on the project. You might have one person working on models and another person working on the code. And you want to keep combining your work and seeing each other's work kind of coming into the project. Another reason is because you may have two people even working on code, hopefully maybe different parts of the code, and you want to, again, keep getting their latest work and giving them your latest work, and a Git repository is a nice, clean way of doing that. Git also is pretty smart about merging code modules that two different people have changed. Sometimes it can't, on its own, figure out how to merge the differences if you type in the same line in the code, for example. But for minor things, two different people editing the same file, it often just knows how to merge it by itself. So Git is a really nice tool. It was invented by the man who invented Linux. Very smart guy. Anyway, so that's why you might want to use Git. Git knows how to synchronize multiple copies of the same repository. So you and your partner may be working on the same project, and you each have a repository on your local machine, and it's a complete history of everybody's work. So, you know, if your friend loses their machine, well, you can easily propagate and build a new copy of that repository on their machine. And to make this really easy, you want to put a master, well, that's not the best word to use, kind of the official origin of the code on a web server, on a cloud service somewhere, so that each of you can pull the latest stuff from it and push changes to it, and everybody stays in sync. That's the way Git works. So there are services that do this. You could set up your own cloud Git repository. People do that sometimes, but there are services that do it, and GitHub is probably the most famous of them. I actually prefer GitLab. They provide a little bit more in the free tier, and they're more independent. GitHub was recently purchased by Microsoft, which is in some ways a good thing. It kind of guarantees its future. It's kind of a bad thing because now Microsoft has kind of a say in its path, and it's not as independent. So I use GitLab. I've used GitHub. I've used them both, but for these projects, I'm using GitLab. I hope that the sound of the yard work isn't too loud in your ears. I apologize for it. All right, so there's a reference document in the lesson that goes to a document of some length about using Git and using Now and private hosting. And you will need to read that document and make use of it. It was just a lot more material than I wanted to try to put in this lesson, or in the main document. But anyway, it has instructions on how you install Git, and you'll need to install a local command line Git tool on your machine so that you can use Git commands to update your repository, to create repositories, etc. And it also talks about the GitLab service. And then let's just talk a little bit about the other main topic of today's lesson, this week's lesson is rather than only being able to see your scenes on your own machine, or only being able to deploy them to Decentraland Land, you can also deploy them to a cloud web service, like a web hosting site. There is a command in the DCL command set called DCL export, and it creates a new directory in your scene called export and puts the content into that directory that would be needed to run your scene as a static website on the web. And then you can place the content of that export directory into a web hosting site. If you have your own web server, for example, you can push that content to it, and you can run the scene. People can visit the scene. The pros of doing this, the reason why you'd want to do this is because maybe you want other people on your team to see a running version of it while you're developing it, without having land or necessarily having to commit it to land. Maybe the scene really isn't ready. Maybe you're making a new version of the scene and you want people to test it and give you feedback before you deploy it to the land. So you could use a static hosting of the site, of the scene, as a staging area or a test area. And the other reason you might want to use it is if you're building a portfolio of your work and Decentraland scenes are part of your portfolio and you want to put that somewhere and be able to link to it from your portfolio page. That's another reason to use static hosting. So I will show you an example of that today. And so I think maybe the easiest thing to do is just to kind of walk through the assignment and do the various things that are needed. So let's start by going to GitLab. Just gitlab.com. And I'm already logged in and I have created an account, but if you don't already have an account there, it would act like if I was logged out. And you can sign in if you have an account, or you can register and create a new account. So that's what you would do to use GitLab, is you provide this information, state that you're not a robot, and you can sign in with all these different methods, but you can also just use a, I think that you can use an email address password. I think that's what I do. Anyway, so yeah. So once you've created an account, then you have, you'll see a projects list, but it'll be empty. And you can start creating new projects here. And you also can create groups, which is a way of grouping one or more projects together, but also more importantly, really assigning certain people to have access to that set of projects in your account. So you can make like a team, a group. So when you create a new project, you typically will say what group it's in, or you can go into a group like this one. I just went into a group that has these scenes that I've mostly made public, these projects, I mean, and then you can say a new project in here, and it'll put it in that group. When you create a new project, it will initially be empty. And so let's just do this to do a class 6 today, right? Yeah. And what it's going to do is it's going to say, well, it's going to live at a URL at gitlab.com/ and the name of your group, if there is one, / and class -6 or whatever you've named you put here. That'll be the URL to it. Test or demo project for lesson 6. And now you have some choice about how visible it is to other people. If you make it public, it really is. Everybody in the world can see it, although that doesn't mean that they can edit it, but they could pull code from it, they could study it. Make it private, then only the people you specifically assign to be able to access it will be able to. So if you're working on a scene that's kind of secret and you don't want the world to know about it, but you want your team members to know about it, or it's only yours and you're just trying to have a safe place to store your code, then you'd make it private. For the purposes of class, of course, I'm going to make this public so you can all see it. I recommend for this way of working that you do not yet create a README. It creates a problem for you later when you try to upload your scene into the repository. You want the repository initially to be empty. And if you have it automatically create a README file for you, it won't be empty and it won't work right. So leave that unchecked. Create the project. And happily, you see that the project is empty, and it gives you some instructions here of Git commands that you would use to do various things when you're starting out. You could make a copy of these for your own notes, but they're basically covered in our documentation too. So then the next thing you want to do is you want to make the scene that you want to put in here if you haven't already made it. And in the document that is linked here in the class 6 that we're in, has on the second page is linked to this document. It's this document here. One of the things it tells you how to do is how to install Git on your own machine. And you will need to do that. Git is a command line program, kind of like DCL or, yeah, like the DCL commands. You're opening a console window and you run Git commands in your directory, your scene directory. And so you will need to install Git on your machine to have the local copy. And that coordinates with the GitLab in the cloud. There are several ways you can use Git with a Decentraland scene. And I've provided 3 options maybe in the table of contents. You can see them all together here. If you have a scene already, that's option 1. You've already previewed it, it's already working, and now you want to store it in Git. You'd use option number 1 in the documentation here. Another option is there already is a repository for the scene, kind of like mine up there. And the way you get it is you either download or you use the git clone command if you have Git installed. And the option 3 is you're creating a brand new scene. There's the steps to start from scratch, and then it links you back to option 1 at some point in the instructions. So let's do the thing that's probably the most likely, which is you already have a scene created. So let's just create a sample scene here. Is that what we called it, class 6? Too many windows open. Yep. Probably should have called it less than 6, but anyway, class 6. It's really a good idea to have the repository name be the same as your scene name, just to remove confusion. So I'm going to go into that directory, and let's say I've already been working on it for a while, so I'm going to do DCL init to create a scene in here to simulate that I've already been working on a scene, and now I want to commit it to Git. Yep, there's the scene, right? Just check it out. It should be the spinning box. Indeed it is. I'm going to go ahead and close that and stop the scene here. And now, I have an example here of a working scene I've already been working on, but it doesn't have a Git repository yet. So the first thing I want to do is and I've already installed Git on this machine, obviously. The first thing I want to do is to, these are preliminary steps, case you don't have the latest Decentraland SDK, and it says that you suggest using the same name. And now I want to create a local Git repository. This will be a repository on my own machine. So in the directory, I type git init. and it works really fast. I want to show you what it just did by opening up the Explorer on this scene. It created this .git directory that didn't exist before. On Unix, dot at the beginning of a directory hides it from normal directory views. It's for semi kind of secret or system stuff. But in Windows, it doesn't hide it, so you see it. And inside there, there's various files and folders that it's created to store the repository. So that's an important directory. If you ever need to get rid of the repository, it's as easy as deleting that directory. So anyway, so now I have a local repository, but the repository is empty. It doesn't have my scene in it yet. I think a useful command is git status. I don't know if it's hard to see here. Can you see the red on my screen? It shows that I have some content in my working directory that doesn't live in the repository yet. So to add things to the repository, to update the repository with your working scene, there are two steps you need to do. One is to say git add space dot. It says add this directory to the repository. It gives you a warning that line feeds will be replaced by carriage return line feed in various files. That's fine. And now git status says something different. It shows all the things that would be added if you wanted to go further. But I see in here, excuse me, I scrolled down up too far. This is all the stuff that it's doing, but it's also committing node modules, right? Node modules is something that's built when you run DCL init or npmi. You don't want to check all that content into the repository, just like you wouldn't put it in a zip file. So I'm going to actually start over. This is not something you'd usually do, but I'm going to actually remove that Git repository and show you what you want to do first. There's a .dcl ignore file in here. This is a file that tells Decentraland which things not to deploy to the land or to pay attention to in building a scene. You can add file names and folders in here. They provide a basic list with DCLNet. It says if you have any of those files, they are not part of the deployed scene. They're part of working with the scene, but not what gets deployed to the land. And a similar file can be built for Git that says there's certain things that should not be pushed into the repository. I have improved versions of both those files that I often pull from scene base. So I'm going to go copy, go up a directory, over to scene base. This updated my Visual Studio Code listing of that. I added these things here to their list because sometimes I'll end up with a zip file in the directory or a Blender file in the directory. That stuff, none of that stuff should go up with a build. So I just added more things. The README is part of one of the files that you often use with Git, but you haven't created one yet. I have some batch files to make some things easier, and we'll talk about some of those things later. But anyway, I've added more things in here that sometimes I end up in my directory and I don't want to go to the build. But similarly, I can copy a better copy of, or get a copy of git ignore, .git ignore, and put that here. these are things that telling Git, don't put these in the repository. I don't want to put the package lock in the repository. I don't want to put the node modules there. If I've created a bin directory or an export directory by builds or export commands, and I forget what SWP is, but somewhere along the line, I found that one of those things should not be being delivered. Anyway, so now if I do a git init here, I've created the directory again, but it doesn't yet have the content in it. Git add dot. It's a shorter list. Nice. Git commit dot. Oh, actually status. Let's look at the status here. You'll see that it's a much more conservative list. It's just the stuff we want to have stored. And then the second command after git add says line those things up for being committed to the repository. It's because you can have files in your directory that you want to omit from being put in it. You can instead, you could say git add specific files, and only those get added to the repository. But when you have a lot of files like this, it's easier to work with a whole directory and to use git ignore to suppress certain things going into the repository. So the next thing you need to do is commit it. But to do that, you need to have an editor associated with the git commit command. And the reason is because every time you do a commit, you're supposed to explain what you're committing, what the change was, so that you can go back to your git log of previous commits and see which one you might want to restore from, or where a problem got introduced or something like that. So you should always write a little bit about the reason why you're committing something. And going back to our document, somewhere up here, I think. Yes. So Git needs an editor that you can use to write your commits, and it will invoke that editor and open it for you when you do the commit command. I use Notepad++ for Git commits. It's nicer than Notepad, but not as nice as Visual Studio Code. I suppose I could use Code, but I don't want to, because you have to close the editor to get the commit to finish, and I don't want to keep closing my code editor. So I use Notepad++, but you can absolutely use Notepad. At the time that you install Git, it asks you what editor you want to use. So if you know that you want to use Notepad++, you might want to go get it in advance. If you're running on Linux, you might want to use Nano. I don't know what the text editor is for Mac, but somebody might type it in the chat here if they know a great editor for use with Git. But a lightweight text editor does not have to have syntax highlighting, but it's nice if it does. So that's one of the reasons why Notepad++ is a little nicer. So before you install Git, you want to go make sure you have the editor that you want to use installed. Git by itself will assume that you want to use the bash editor from Linux, and it will, I think, actually install that for you, but it's hard to use if you're not familiar with it. The keystrokes for saving and getting around and stuff, it's a little awkward if you're used to Mac or Windows. So I hear somebody's mic turned on. You have something you want to say? Okay. If you have already installed Git and you want to set the editor or change the editor, here's the command for doing it. It's in the document here. Git config and _ global. You name the core.editor and you name the name of the invocation command for invoking that editor. You can invoke Notepad or Notepad++ at the command line if you know to type that. Like, for example, if I was in here and I typed Notepad, it will actually bring up Notepad. Notepad++ must have a little different name, or I mistyped it or something. I don't remember what it's called. Anyway, it has a command line for invocation too. So my local Git commands are set up to use Notepad++. So the next thing you would do, if you remember, we added the files to be set up to be committed by doing the git add dot. And so the next step is git commit dot. And it will open up the editor for putting a comment in. And you put your comments up here on one or more lines at the beginning, but you do it before that content is at line 2. So we could do something like initial commit of the DCL init content, or boilerplate, let's say. And then you can add additional lines. Anything you want here. Whatever. Any lines that are above this then become the comment for that check-in. I don't need the extra line here. Probably wouldn't hurt anything, but I'm going to hit Control S to save it, or I could click that little button. And then I just close it. I'm using Alt F4 to close it. And Git notices that I closed it with an edit, that I changed it and closed it. If I close it without saving it, it says, well, you didn't edit the file, so it doesn't do the commit. You have to save the file with a commit statement in it and then close it, and then it will finish the commit. Now, if I do a git status, it says I'm up to date. That says that my local repository matches my working directory. Nothing's changed. And so the next thing I want to do is I want to associate this local repository with when I created a GitLab that's currently empty. So that is done in this next step. Here's the git commit step. This command here is what I want to use with my own repository URL. It says I want to add this repository into the remote repository whose URL is where I'll get it for it, show you where to get it. So I'm pasting that in there with a space at the end. And I go back to my repository here for this class that's currently empty. And I go to the clone pull down and copy into the clipboard the URL that's the clone URL. This URL is the URL that refers to this repository. It's used for cloning it. It's used for this command as well. So I've copied that here. Go back here, Control V to paste it in. I'm saying connect this local repository to the one in the cloud, and the one in the cloud is the origin. It's the official one. The one on my local machine now is just like a slave to that. Very quick thing again. And going back to our step-by-step, I just want to make sure that that worked. So I'm going to use this command here just to test it, make sure that it has URLs hooked up. It has it hooked up both for fetching, that's pulling stuff from it, and also for pushing things to it. So now I want to push my local repository state into the remote repository. And I do that by doing a git push. Now I'm going to show you what happens the very first time you do a git push. It tells you, this is the first time you need to use a little bit more elaborate command. And it's nice to not have to memorize this command and that it tells you how to do it, but it's also provided here in the document. It's exactly the same as what it's told you to do. So you can copy from either one. It did not actually do the push because you haven't given it quite enough information to, so I just copied that. You haven't given it quite enough information about how you want it to live in that repository. Well, I want it to live as the master in my master branch. Notice the trunk of the tree, not any of the branches that I talked about. I want it to be the main code base in the repository. It's now saying something a little different with git status than it did before. Up here, when I did a git status, it just says nothing to commit. Working tree is clean. In other words, I don't know about any remote repository, and all your changed, edited code, your new code, whatever, is checked in. So the tree is clean. There's nothing that you've touched since then. In this case, when I did it, when there's a remote repository, it says that it says what it set up above, but it also says this here, which is that your working branch that you're on, which happens to be master, the master branch, is up to date with origin master. Let's make a little change to, before we do that, let's go back over to the Git repository, which, excuse me, that's right up here. And it still says it's empty because I haven't refreshed the page. But if I refresh the page, now instead of saying it's empty, it has my stuff in it. And just like the sample scenes you looked at, you can actually examine this stuff in the repository in GitLab. You know, if you just wanted to copy a little piece of code from it, you could. If somebody else wants to clone it to their machine, what you do is you go to the root of the repository here and get the URL from here and come back here and make a new directory. I'm going to show you what happens with regard to the naming. When you do a git clone, which we're about to do, it creates a directory to put the stuff in, and it will name it after repositories. So if I did it right here, I would be trying to do it over the top of or into the directory I already have, which is not what I want. So I'm going to just go down to a temporary directory. I'll do the git clone here. So I'm going to say git clone, and then I had that URL in my clipboard that I got off of that blue button. Git clone and the URL of the directory. And now in this temporary directory, I have a class 6 directory. I just got a new, I just copied that other repository into a new directory named after the repository. If I go in here, you'll see I have a complete pull of everything. But it doesn't have the command line directory doesn't show the .git directory, but it really is here. So this is a complete local new local copy of the repository. So I actually have 2 repositories of this on my machine. I'm not going to keep this one, but that's what you want to do if you want to go get somebody else's code. You use git clone and the URL of their repository. But remember that it creates a directory that is named the same as the repository name. Creates it as a subdirectory of the directory you're in. I'm going to remove that temp directory and everything under it. The /s means subdirectories as well. Yes, thank you. Now I still have the class 6 directory here. Let's see what happens when I make a change. I'm going to edit the game.ts file in my class 6 thing. And let's just say all I'm going to do right now is not actually change any code. So I'm just going to put some comments to the top saying demo for class lesson 6. All right, just put a banner up here. That's a change. It's a valid change. Doesn't really do anything to the way the scene behaves, but if I do a status here now, it's going to say you have a modified game source file, and it's not in your repository. It's not even lined up to be committed to the repository. So there's the two steps I need to do are git add. It says add everything that's changed or been added to this directory. And now if I do git status, it says I have one thing that's been added. The add in this case refers to the addition of a change in the file, but it does say modified instead of new. If I created a new file, like if I put a modules, additional TypeScript file in, it would show as added. So now I go git commit. Up comes the editor for the commit comment. My cursor's in the right place, so I simply type added a comment banner at the top of game.ts as an example of a comment. Control S to save it, Alt F4 to close it. And you saw the command line jump because it did the commit. If I do a git status now, everything's clean. However, it says your branch is ahead of the origin by one commit. So I haven't pushed this to the cloud yet. So the repository here, if I even do a refresh, okay, and go into source, games.ts, the banner isn't here yet at the top. So I'm going to do a git push, which is the command that pushes it from my local repository into the remote origin repository. And now if I do a git status, it'll say, not only is my working directory clean, but it matches the version in the origin. And if I refresh this page, Control F5, the banner is there now in the cloud repository. Now I'm going to do it the other way around, which is I'm going to make a change in the file through the cloud. This could be like if maybe somebody else was working on the project and they submitted their changes to the repository, but you don't have them yet. Or by chance, you might create a file or make a change in here. Use the web editor. I just clicked edit. Just put the date on it. Why not? There should be a save down here somewhere. There it is, commit changes. Here's your commit message. In this case, you're doing it in the web. You say added date to header. You want to leave this at master unless you're working on a branch, and I'm not going to cover branches in this lesson. Commit changes. That does the whole thing of the add and the commit and everything into the repository. And now the official version of it, I'm just doing a refresh just for grins. You can see that it's there. Now if I come back here and say git status, slightly a surprise. It doesn't say what I expected. However, if I just come back here to the root of this and look at the interesting. There really is another commit here. Git diff. It says that there's no difference. I'm going to just do a git pull, which is how you pull changes that are in the cloud back to your machine and merge them into your stuff. And it says it got a file. So my git status didn't show me that it needed to be done. Surprises me a little bit, but there's the date. So yeah, there's a footnote there. There's a little confusion in my mind about what git status will show you. Git diff also is another command that shows you the difference between your stuff and the official one in the cloud. So one of those things I would have expected. But we're moving right along. I'm going to now talk about why you might want to. So anyway, the idea is you make some changes, you do some testing, you like it, do a git add, git commit, git push. You make some more changes, you like it, it's pretty good. It's a stable point, you do a git add, git commit, git push. It's a backup system for you, but it's a backup with all this other capabilities of other people working on it also and making it available to them in the cloud. README. README.md file, without a period at the very end, just this much, is a standard Git file name for explaining what's in this repository. It's like the documentation, the basic documentation for the site, for the repository. So if I go, you could create a file manually called that and commit it, or if the other alternative, which I'll show you, is you can go into the repository and it says add a README because it's noticing that you don't have one. So I'm going to do it that way. Add the README, and it opens it up as an editor. This is a demo for lesson 6 of the building in Decentraland. The commit message is fine. And if I look at the repository and look at the commits, there's been 4 commits to this so far, including this new one that was done in the cloud. If I go to my repository locally, my local scene, we'll pull that README. And now if I go code, it's in the directory. And there's what I typed in. So any questions so far on why you would do this or how you get it set up or any of the particular commands? In that case, I'm going to move on to the next topic in the class, which is other places you can host your scenes besides on your own machine in preview mode, DCL start to see your scene locally, or if you have land, you can push to the land, and we'll talk more about that in a later lesson. But you can also put the scene into a cloud web hosting service, either your own server or any of several others that you can use for free or rent some space on. I'm going to talk about 3 different ones today. The easiest one and free is a hosting company called Zeit, and they have a hosting service called Now, which is incredibly easy to use and it's free. And pretty well supported by Decentraland. There have been bugs between the 2 systems at times. The most serious of those were recently fixed, but there still is one that I want to bring to your attention. I've mentioned it to Decentraland, but I think really it's a Zeit issue, but there's a workaround for it, and I'll tell you what that is. So you install Zeit. Again, you need some local commands to run it. You install it using the npm, the node package manager command. You install it globally, so you use the I and the -G. And now is the name of the package. I've already done that on my machine, but I'll just show you what happens. So you'd say npm I -G now. I already have it installed. It'll just make sure that I have the latest version, which is 16.1.2. So basically, it just did a reinstall and installed the latest version. And then to use it, you use a DCL command called build, which does half of what DCL start does. DCL start calls a build, and then it opens up a browser and runs that build. But DCL build by itself just creates the bin directory. It just creates the scene files in their final form. DCL export is a command that you run after that, which creates an export directory, which contains a version of your scene that's designed to run elsewhere than on Decentraland land. It's designed to run in a web hosting facility. So let's do that with our test scene. So DCL build. Probably don't need to do that really because I ran a DCL start a little while ago, so it's already built. But now there is a bin directory that's current, and DCL export. And now there is an export directory that wasn't there before. I'm just going to look in it for a moment. It doesn't look quite the same as what you see in the your own working directory. It has a few other things. It has a bin directory, kind of like probably what's in the bin of the Decentraland scene, but it might be different. It has various images that are needed. It has a web page called index.html, which is the default, one of the default web pages for web servers. When I say default web page, I mean you don't have to specify it in a URL. It can just be in the directory that the URL points at, and the web server will know to look for it and load it. And it has some other stuff, but I guess, really interestingly, it has combined all of the TypeScript and JavaScript modules that are needed to run the scene into this one giant preview.js, which the HTML file loads. So it has your code and it has all of the SDK that's needed for your scene, etc. It also has a copy of scene.json, which we'll study more when we talk about deploying to land. And it has the whole Unity runtime. That's the rendering engine. It has the static web version of the Unity rendering engine. So this is all the stuff you would need to run the scene on your own web server. So which web server do we want to use? Well, there's Zeit now, which is recommended by Decentraland. And so I'm just going to type now in this directory since I've installed now. I've gone into the export directory and I type now. The very first time that I ran now, it asked me who I was. Now, I've done that before, but the very first time you run now in a directory, it asks for your email address and will send you an email to verify that you are that email address, and it'll ask you for a username like C. Fravel. It just does that because you type now, but it only happens the first time. So it sets up an account for you at now the first time you use it. My memory is that after it does that, you have to run now again to actually deploy your scene. But I have actually deployed the scene. Now, I'm just going to copy this URL into my clipboard and go there. That's encouraging. But you notice I'm not at explorer.decentraland. I'm at now.sh with my username and the directory name of where I exported from. Voila. I could provide this URL with or without the position to somebody else, and they could load the scene and see it. I'm going to put it in the message. I'm just curious. I don't think that this supports multiple users chatting or seeing each other, but I might be wrong. Somebody want to give it a try? Let me know if anybody else has entered the scene. Yeah, the chat doesn't seem to work. My guess is that there is no communication between users like there is in the real world through the communication server. Oh, yes, you do not see me in my scene. Okay. I'm looking at Ember's comments here. Ember, could you explain what you see? Do you see an error message? Do you get the Decentraland logo? Do you see an empty scene? What do you see? I see your image, and okay, and can you type F12? I'm going to show you here, I guess. Yes. F12 on a scene that's working should, am I hitting? Yeah, F12. There are some errors here, but those errors are okay because it's working. Yeah, it's not figuring out my profile as a user and stuff like that. Kind of expected. I'm going to follow your link and see what that looks like in the browser with F12. It's not obvious to me. Is it obvious to anybody else what the error is here? That first error is the same, so that's not it. But this one is new. Yeah, we'll figure this out later. Yeah, not obvious. It may be something we need some help from Decentraland in sorting out. All right, so I'm glad to see that it's working for at least one other person. So the basic approach works. All right. Yeah. So here's the problem with the bug that I mentioned with Site, and that is it's having trouble. It seems like it changes path names and file names to lowercase when it uploads them. But if your original scene has, in your game.ts, you have references to paths or file names that have capital letters in them, well, then it won't hook them up. So if you're going to be using Zeit now version 16, until that gets resolved, I would suggest that you make sure that your path names and your file names are all lowercase. I've sent that as with a demo of it to Decentraland, but I'm pretty sure it's actually a Zeit problem. There may be some parameter that you use to make it not change the case. I don't know. but you can work around it by just having everything lowercase in your subdirectories, like models, and then if it's a subdirectory under models, make sure that subdirectory is all lowercase. Any GLTF files or materials, their file names are all lowercase. There are other hosting services for websites, right? There's like hundreds of them. Here are three that I consider good and have used. DigitalOcean, Ionos, which used to be called One-on-One. I'm just gonna make a note here in case people. Watching me learn how to type. And GoDaddy, that's another one a lot of people use. If you create an account on one of these services and set up different ones do it differently, but set up what you need to have on their service to have a website. And what you put into the website is the content of your export directory from the DCL build and DCL export commands. But it must be at the root of the domain or at the root of a subdomain. You can't, the URL, to make it work, the URL cannot have a path at the end. The way that they export the scene doesn't work if you do it that way, because it assumes that the other calls within your scene to the content in the scene assume it's at the root of the domain or subdomain. So an example of that is on the file server itself, the web server on itself, when you're putting the content on, you can have any path you want, but when you hook that up to a domain or a subdomain name, that has to point right into the directory where your content is. It can't point higher in the directory tree. I want to show you an example of that. I usually use a service, the Ionos service. I have a lot of websites, WordPress sites, etc. there. Been using it for many years. It's not what I recommend. If you don't know about any of these things and you want to start from scratch and have the cheapest possible solution, I would consider looking at DigitalOcean. And down further in the document here, I kind of have how you set that up. But DigitalOcean creates little teeny virtual Linux servers that you can use, but you have to be willing to learn about Linux command line stuff to create users and create directories and set up a web server, etc. But you can get a good solution perfectly fine for hosting one or more scenes for $5 a month. The nice thing about Zeit is it's free. Excuse me, there's one more thing I want to talk about Zeit. If I were to do this Zeit deployment several different times for different scenes in this way, notice that my URL contained as the first segment of the URL the name of the directory I'm in. Well, that's the same directory on every one of my scenes, so they would all end up getting, one at a time, they'd get pushed into the same, replacing the previous scene. So instead, there's a file that I often use, and it conforms with the now standards. I have a copy of it as an example in the scene base. It's a very short JSON file, and the most important thing here is what do I want the name of the scene to be on my account on now. So you want to change this, obviously, but if we call it class 6, for example, I saved it, it's in that directory, and now I do I copy that. I store it in the main directory of my scene, because the export directory might get deleted at some point because it's a build directory. So I don't want to store it there. I want to git add, I want to put it in my repository. See how quick it is to do that? Now, what I didn't do is I didn't test it first, which probably would have been wise. But now I'm going to copy now.json into the export directory. And change directory into export. And run now. And now the now command will notice that there's a now.json file there, and it will name the destination directory according to that naming. And now you see, instead of being in export, which is very generic, it's actually the name I specified in the now.json file. Just to show that it works. Seems like the latest SDK takes a little longer at its first step to load. I'm not sure what that's about. Oh, also, by the way, now.json, I mean, now the ZiteNow service, I don't think it's as fast at delivering content to your scene as the Decentraland content servers. So I think the scene may take longer if it's very complex, longer to show up. Don't be surprised. It doesn't necessarily mean there's something horribly wrong with your scene. It just means that that free service at ZiteNow is not real fast. Anyway, so the scene works, and you can see the URL now that I got as a result has class 6 in it. By the way, that other scene at export still exists. There's probably some way to delete things from ZiteNow, but I don't know what it is. You'd have to go to the website and learn. I just have never done it. I'm going to show you what I do at Ionis because I have it all set up. I started to set up DigitalOcean today and wrote some notes into this document on how to do it. I don't know that those notes are entirely proven or complete. So, but I will say DigitalOcean is a really nice place to work if you're comfortable with learning some Linux. You don't have to learn a lot, but you have to learn a little bit. And the DigitalOcean documentation that they have is superb. It's some of the best technical documentation for, I'd say, just beginning users that I've seen anywhere. So I highly recommend them. I just have an account at Ionis and had for years, and so I'm going to show you how to use a web server, a web hosting site to host a scene. So I set some of this up last night, but I'm going to go into it again and show you what I did. This company has hosting centers in a number of places, but they are a German company. So I have many domains here. But the one I set up for this was a subdomain of Fravel.net. And subdomains up here. And the one I set up last night was yeah, this one right here, because I was showing a bug to Decentraland. But I'm going to create a new subdomain for this site and add subdomain over here. Subdomain means like Fravel.net with something in front of it, like class 6. Most places that allow you to host domain names allow you to make subdomains for free. So I do pay for the base domain, but there's a new class 6 here. Going in here, and it says, what is the destination in your folder structure on the server that this subdomain should load, what website. And so I'm going to push the content from my engine, my export directory, up into the server in a directory there. And you use an FTP client to do this, file transfer protocol. FileZilla is a very popular one. I use WinSCP. WinSCP. And it allows me to connect to a lot of different hosting facilities. Fravel.net is the one I'm interested in. And last time I used it, I was working on the VRS site. So it remembered that. But if I go up to Fravel.net, and the www directory is just the root of the websites. And I have no directory in here yet called class 6, so I'm going to create a new directory called class -6. And I'm going to go back to Ionos and say that the place where I want class-6.fravel.net to load its web page from is the target of down in my Fravel.net directory. In the www section, class 6, right there. Yeah, it looks right there. So I hit save. Now I've associated class6.fravel.net with that directory on the server. And now I just need to push the content there. So if I go back to where I have in my users directory, Fravel. Oh, there's more directories. So here's WebVR. Sorry, I couldn't find it. DCL library, I believe, class 6. This content in the export directory of my scene, I'm just going to take all that and drag it over here into that on the remote server. It'll take a moment. Now, I want to show you what happens if you try to go to fravel.net/, because that's where it actually is. But I think it throws a bunch of errors, if I remember right, and it doesn't load. Let's see if it finishes and that I'm wrong. It can be in a subdirectory, but I don't think so. Yeah. You see that it's trying to load stuff out of the root directory of the domain. It's ignoring the class 6 here. So it's going to get stuck here. It's not going to work. So instead, I use the subdomain I used, class6.fravel.net, like that. And now I won't get those errors, and it will load. So to be clear, you have to create a subdomain and have it load from the root of that subdomain. And there it is. There's our scene on my own web server. So once again, you might want to do this because you want to. Something I said sounded like the Amazon robot's name. Anyway, one of the reasons you might want to do this is because you might want to build a portfolio of your work, and you want to show scenes that you've built, but not have them be necessarily being shown from the land. Maybe something you built that you're really proud of, but you don't have any land to put it on, or don't want to put it on the land. But this link now becomes something you can link from your portfolio, right? And people can go visit it and see. You make a big scene here, you make a big scene. Anyway, so that's one reason. Another reason is because you may be working with a team, and you have a place where you can have people see the results and walk around it as people are working on it. And you have people who don't necessarily have the skills to build and put stuff up, but have helped you with design or color or theme, and you can go show them this and get their feedback. Get somebody to test it that isn't necessarily a builder, but is a representative of a user. I think that's the material I had to cover today. Let's just see if there's anything left in this subsidiary document here. Oh yeah, I included in this file some examples of some of the other files that I have in scene base, and kind of what they're for. I also actually put copies of them in here in case you just want to copy from here. I used, I guess one more thing I want to mention. We'll talk about it more in the next lesson, but there's a file in your folder, in your scene folder. Here it is, called scene.json. I'm double clicking on it to open it up in code. And we've looked at this briefly before, but what I wanted to talk about was this part right here that says where in the world, at what coordinates are my scene, and how many parcels are in that scene. So if I, for example, add a second parcel here, and leave the base parcel where it is, Control S, come back to my directory here. The scene now won't just have one parcel of that gray grid, it'll have two parcels of it. Can you guess where the second one will be? What direction? It's the second parameter, which is the north-south parameter, right? So it'll be one parcel north. So it'll be, when I'm facing north, when I first enter the scene, it'll be further north. See that? I'm looking north, and now there's a second parcel up there. If I do, oh, need a comma there. Now I'll also have a parcel to the Control F5 to reload it. Bet you didn't know that you could make non-rectangular scenes, but you can. In fact, you can make donut-shaped scenes. I've done it before. Put a different scene in the middle of the donut. Anyway, so, but what's interesting is if I were to say, let's actually do this at 20. If I reload the scene now, oh, the latest version of the SDK reloads the scene as soon as you change it. Make certain changes in the game.ts or the scene.json file, and it reloads the scene for you. Where's my scene? Well, it's not here. It's at 20. I go up here to the position. This is a really important thing to understand because you can get really confused. If you're working on a scene that you're going to deploy to land, you can't deploy it to the central POSIT. It's not yours, not your land to deploy in, so you can't deploy it 0, 0. You have to deploy it to the coordinates of your land, which are specified up here. The %2c is another representation of comma, by the way. So if I just put comma there, it's kind of a little more readable, but it switches it back to when it gets there. You see that here. So don't be confused. This %2c is just a comma between the two coordinates. So now I'm where that is in the world. So when you're doing your rapid development of editing something, looking at it, editing something, looking at it, it's kind of a pain to have to keep setting the parameters off to 20 something or whatever. So you may want to initially develop your scene for 0, 0, and you may want to use 0, 0 for the location of your scene if you're deploying it to Zeit or someplace else, so that the URL that you give somebody is just like that, without all this. It'll set that when it gets there, but if the scene is somewhere other than 0, 0, there'll be nothing there when they go there because it's often off somewhere else. So to manage that complexity of, well, am I working at it with 0, 0, or am I working at it where it really will go in the world? I've created some utilities that just make that work a little easier. One thing I do is I have 2 alternate scene JSON files, one called deploy and one called export. The export one puts the scene at 0, whereas the deploy one puts it where the land will really go. And then I copy the one I want to use over the top of scene.json before I deploy or export or whatever. And to make that easier, I have some batch files to do that. And I have not updated these recently. Oh yeah, they're there. This is right. So if I want to deploy it to now, I have this batch file that removes the existing export, which is why you don't want to store now.json there. Copies the export version of scene.json over the working version. Calls npm i, dcl build, dcl export, just to make sure everything's in good shape and is fully built into the export directory. I copy my now.json, which lives in the root of the directory tree for check-in, but I copied it into export. I change directory in export, I call now, and then I go back to the root directory and I change it back to the normal version of the scene deploy. And the result is that I'm working, when I deliver it, it's delivered at 0, 0. That's the point. The other thing I do that just kind of makes my work easier is when I'm actually building it and on the way to deploying something into the world, I'll actually work at the world coordinates. And what I do to manage that is I keep some bookmarks in a folder on my bookmarks called previews. Like for example, for the conference center, I have different scenes and I have the URL for when I want to preview it with DCL start, but with parameters, I mean with coordinates, and with for when it goes to now, it's at 0, 0, but it has a different path. And then the real position of it in the world in Explorer. So I keep some bookmarks to the different places where I may want to look at the scene as I'm working on it. And it kind of saves a lot of headache. But I want to have a version of my scene.json set for 0, 0 in case that's where I want to export it for. And by the way, there was a play test yesterday afternoon, and I think we had, you know, between 50 and 100 avatars in the world bouncing around between some of the same scenes. So the capacity of scenes to hold a lot of people is getting there. And they've hooked up the passport with your real name and your customized avatar to your login now. So they're getting that stuff working. Interestingly, it didn't ask me for a login here. I may have a, yeah, you had a problem of some sort. Not sure what. I'm not going to try to debug that right now, but I think that covers what I wanted to cover today. Let's see, go back to the main document. So let's just briefly walk through the steps of the assignment and see that it's clearing up my screen here so I can see what I'm doing. Basically, the assignment, you go set up a GitLab free account. You pick some scene that you want to put into GitLab, and I do recommend that you read this document and understand that and work through that stuff. But basically, the summary is you put a git ignore in your file, like in your directory, like we did, so that it doesn't push things you don't want. You can get a copy of that from Scenebase. Git add, git commit. The first time you need to hook up the local repository to the remote one. Do a push. If you wanted to get a copy of that, or somebody else wants to get a copy of it, they use git clone. And then the assignment is to go ahead and deploy to the now server. My document walks you through that. This link here is also Decentraland's blog post on doing it. It's quite good. So the assignment is to put a scene of yours into a Git repository at GitLab, or if you already are a user of GitHub and prefer to do that, that's fine. There's other ones too, Bitbucket. But GitLab is the one I've documented here. And then deliver it to Zeit Now or some other hosting service. The bonus work would be host it somewhere else. If you have a website, you're welcome to do that. But deploying it to Zeit Now would be the secondary part of this. And there's two links then to put into the class. One is the Git repository, and the other is a link to the Zeit Now implementation. Any questions? I'm opening up my chat. I haven't looked at it for a little while. Any questions on today's lesson or anything in review? Any challenges people are running into? If you're not aware of it, there is a game jam being sponsored by Decentraland. It's like a hackathon for interactive scenes. They decided to call it a game jam this time. There are prizes. They're not insignificant. If you want to work on game jam work as part of your classwork or separately, I encourage you to do it. You can work alone or with others. Part of the purpose of this class is to set you up to be able to work in teams through things like getting to know each other and using GitLab. So I would encourage it to be a good exercise. You can find out more about it in the Decentraland blog. And if there's no other questions, I think we'll wrap a little early today. Okay, thank you all. Have fun. Go out and build.